The crystal chandeliers of Bella Vista restaurant cast dancing shadows across marble floors, polished to mirror brightness. Seattle's skyline glittered through floor-to-ceiling windows as the city's elite filled tables that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The air hummed with quiet conversations and the soft clink of silverware against bone china plates. Victoria Matthews stepped through the mahogany doors like she owned the world. And in many ways she did. At 34, she controlled a $2.8 billion empire, her face gracing the covers of Forbes and Fortune magazines monthly. Her tailored black dress probably cost more than a car, and the diamond earrings catching the light could have funded a small charity for a year. But the woman who could make CEOs tremble with a single phone call looked helpless as her 6-year-old son Connor clutched her dress with white knuckles. "Mom, I'm scared of all these people," Connor whispered, his voice barely audible above the restaurant's elegant buzz. His expensive little suit hung perfectly on his small frame, but his eyes darted nervously around the room like a trapped animal. Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd planned this evening carefully. A controlled media appearance at Seattle's most photographed restaurant. Her publicist had arranged for strategic camera angles to capture her in a moment of maternal warmth. The goal was simple: soften her ice-cold public image with some carefully orchestrated family time. What she hadn't planned for was Connor's fear, or her own growing realization that her son had learned to be as emotionally distant as she was. "Connor, stand up straight," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same tone she used in boardroom negotiations. "We're going to the VIP section. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel." As the hostess led them toward the exclusive dining area, Victoria's attention was suddenly caught by something unexpected. In a small corner table, tucked away from the main dining room, sat a man in a faded blue shirt, carefully cutting pasta into perfect bite-sized pieces for a little girl who was giggling like she'd just heard the funniest joke in the world. The contrast hit Victoria like a physical blow. While her son clung to her dress in terror, this child was absolutely radiant with joy. Michael Torres wiped his hands on a paper napkin and smiled at his 8-year-old daughter Emma. His shirt might have been through the washing machine 100 times, and his jeans showed signs of honest wear, but his eyes held a warmth that could have heated the entire restaurant. "Daddy, this place is so fancy." Emma's brown eyes sparkled as she took in the chandeliers above them. "It's like a princess castle." Michael's chest tightened with a familiar mix of love and worry. This dinner was stretching their budget to the breaking point, but Emma had brought home a perfect report card for the first time since her mother's death 2 years ago. Some victories deserved celebration, even if it meant eating ramen for the rest of the week. "You earned this, sweetheart," he said, watching her marvel at the elegant surroundings. "Straight A's don't just happen. You worked hard for this." The truth was they weren't supposed to be here at all. Michael had brought Emma to the small cafe next door, a modest place that served excellent pasta at prices a delivery driver could afford. But when they'd arrived, a harried staff member had mistakenly seated them in a quiet corner of the main restaurant. Michael had been too embarrassed to correct the mistake, too afraid of the shame of being moved. He just wanted Emma to see the beautiful lights for one evening. Emma was a ray of sunshine in human form. Bright, curious, and remarkably friendly, she had the gift of finding joy in the smallest things. While other children her age were glued to tablets and phones, Emma preferred building blanket forts and creating elaborate stories about the people she saw. "Daddy, look at that lady's dress," Emma whispered, nodding toward Victoria. "She looks like a queen, but she seems sad. And that little boy looks scared." Michael followed his daughter's gaze and felt his breath catch. Even from across the room he recognized Victoria Matthews. Her face had been on the cover of Business Weekly just last month, accompanying an article about the youngest woman to ever control a multi-billion-dollar corporation. But Emma wasn't seeing the powerful CEO. She was seeing a mother with a frightened child. "Maybe they just need to sit somewhere more friendly," Emma said, with the simple wisdom of childhood. "Like with us." Michael smiled despite himself. His daughter's capacity for empathy never ceased to amaze him. After losing her mother to cancer, Emma could have become bitter or withdrawn. Instead, she'd somehow learned to see the pain in others and want to help. "I think they'll be fine, honey," Michael said gently. "People like that probably prefer to sit by themselves." But even as he said it, his eyes lingered on the little boy's frightened face. As a single father who'd spent the last 2 years learning to read every emotion that crossed his daughter's features, he recognized the signs of a child who felt utterly alone, even in the presence of his parent. Victoria's world was one of calculated moves and strategic thinking. She'd built her empire by never showing weakness, never allowing emotion to cloud her judgment. But watching her son's terrified grip on her dress, she felt something crack in the armor she'd spent years constructing. Connor had everything money could buy. The best clothes, the finest tutors, the most expensive toys. But he'd never laughed the way that little girl across the room was laughing. He'd never looked at her the way that child looked at her father. For the first time in years, Victoria wondered if she'd been building the wrong kind of life. The hostess gestured toward their reserved table in the VIP section, a private alcove surrounded by frosted glass panels that would ensure their privacy and the perfect lighting for photographs. It was exactly what Victoria had requested, exactly what she needed for her public image. But Connor had stopped walking. His small hand pointed toward Michael and Emma's corner table, and when he looked up at his mother, his eyes held something Victoria hadn't seen in months. Hope. "Mom." Connor whispered his voice, carrying a longing that made Victoria's chest tighten. "I want to sit next to them." Victoria's first instinct was to dismiss Connor's request with the same efficient authority she used to handle disruptive board members. They had a plan. They had reservations. They had photographers strategically positioned to capture her in flattering light. But Connor's grip on her dress had loosened for the first time all evening, and he was staring across the restaurant with an intensity that seemed to pull his entire small body toward that corner table. "Connor, we have our own table," Victoria said, her voice carrying the practiced patience of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "The VIP section has better." "She's so happy," Connor interrupted something he never did. Victoria's son had learned early that interrupting mother during business discussions was not tolerated, but his eyes remained fixed on Emma, who was now animatedly telling her father a story that involved wild hand gestures and the kind of uninhibited laughter that made other diners turn and smile. Victoria followed her son's gaze and watched the little girl's face light up as she described what appeared to be an epic battle between her pasta and her fork. The child's joy was infectious, completely genuine, the kind of pure happiness that Victoria realized she hadn't seen Connor express since she couldn't remember when. Michael leaned forward, giving Emma his complete attention as she narrated her story. His worn hands moved with gentle precision as he cut her pasta into perfect pieces, each motion deliberate and caring. There was something almost ritualistic about the way he performed this simple task, as if it was the most important thing in the world. Connor's breath fogged the air in a small sigh. "Mom, why doesn't anyone cut my food like that?" The question hit Victoria like ice water in her veins. Connor had nannies who prepared his meals with mathematical precision, chefs who crafted nutritionally balanced plates that looked like art installations, personal assistants who managed every detail of his daily routine. But no one sat with him and cut his pasta while listening to his stories. "You're old enough to cut your own food," Victoria said automatically. the response programmed by years of teaching Connor independence and self-reliance. "I know," Connor said quietly. "But it looks nice when someone does it because they want to. Have you ever felt completely out of place in a fancy setting? Drop a comment below. You're not alone in that feeling." The hostess appeared beside them, clipboard in hand, and professional smile perfectly arranged. "Mrs. Matthews, your table is ready. We have the lighting adjusted exactly as requested, and the photographer will be positioned—" "Wait!" Connor said, his small voice carrying a determination that surprised everyone, including himself. "I want to sit with that girl." Victoria looked down at her son, really looked at him, and saw something that made her chest tighten with an unfamiliar emotion. Connor's eyes were bright with possibility for the first time in months. The careful mask he wore at business dinners and charity events had slipped away, revealing the 6-year-old boy underneath. "She looks fun," Connor continued, his voice growing stronger. "And her daddy smiles when he talks to her. Real smiles." The implication hung in the air between them. Victoria's smiles were trained, professional, strategic. Even with Connor, her expressions were carefully controlled, designed to project competence and authority rather than warmth. Michael was laughing now, a deep, genuine sound that carried across the restaurant. Emma had apparently reached the climax of her story, and her father's reaction was everything a storyteller could want. His whole face transformed when he laughed, years of worry and exhaustion melting away to reveal the man he might have been under different circumstances. Connor took a step toward their table, then stopped and looked back at his mother with pleading eyes. "Please, Mom, just for tonight." Victoria felt the weight of every decision she'd made in the past 6 years pressing down on her shoulders. The careful distance she'd maintained from Connor to protect him from the cutthroat world of corporate politics. The emotional walls she'd built to shield them both from the vulnerability that had destroyed her own childhood. But standing here in this restaurant, watching her son reach toward something she'd never learned to give him, Victoria realized that her protection might have become a prison. The floor manager appeared at Victoria's elbow, his voice low and urgent. "Mrs. Matthews, I apologize, but there seems to be a slight situation with the seating." Victoria's attention snapped to the nervous man beside her. "Excuse me." "The family at that corner table," he said, gesturing discreetly toward Michael and Emma. "They appear to have been seated in error. They're not suitable for the main dining area. Perhaps they would be more comfortable in our casual section, or suitable." The word came out sharper than Victoria intended. She was accustomed to making quick assessments of people's worth based on their appearance, their connections, their potential value to her business interests. It was a survival skill in her world. But watching Connor's face fall as the manager spoke, she felt something shift inside her chest. "They look perfectly suitable to me," Connor said with the blunt honesty of childhood. "They look happy." The manager's smile tightened. "Of course, young Mr. Matthews, but perhaps your mother would prefer." "My son decides where we sit tonight," Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that ended discussions immediately. Connor's face transformed, hope blooming across his features like sunrise after a long night. He looked up at Victoria with an expression she hadn't seen since he was very small, before he'd learned to be careful around her moods and schedules. "Really?" he whispered. Victoria looked from her son's pleading eyes to the manager's condescending face, then across the room to where Michael was helping Emma with her drink. His entire attention focused on his daughter's needs. For once in her carefully controlled life, Victoria made a decision based purely on emotion. "Really," she said. "Lead the way." Victoria's heels clicked against the marble floor with the rhythm of someone marching into battle. Connor practically bounced beside her, his earlier fear replaced by an excitement that seemed to vibrate through his small body. The hostess and floor manager trailed behind them, clearly uncertain about this deviation from the carefully planned evening. As they approached Michael's table, Victoria felt her corporate confidence wavering slightly. She was comfortable commanding boardrooms full of Harvard MBAs and intimidating CEOs worth hundreds of millions. But approaching a complete stranger to ask if her son could join their family dinner felt like stepping into foreign territory. Michael looked up from Emma's animated story about her teacher's pet goldfish and nearly choked on his water. His eyes went wide as he took in the woman standing beside his table. The same face he'd seen on countless business magazines, now here in person, close enough that he could smell her expensive perfume. "Oh my God," he whispered under his breath. Then immediately caught himself. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "It's perfectly fine," Victoria said, though her voice carried the same crisp tone she used in business negotiations. She gestured to Connor, who was practically vibrating with excitement beside her. "My son really wants to sit with you folks. Would that be okay?" Emma's face lit up like someone had just told her Christmas was happening twice this year. "Yes," she practically shouted, then caught herself and covered her mouth with both hands. Yes, please. You can sit right here." She patted the empty chairs enthusiastically. Michael's brain struggled to process what was happening. Victoria Matthews, the woman whose company probably had more money than his entire neighborhood would see in a lifetime, was asking to sit at his humble table. His mind raced through possible explanations. Was this some kind of corporate social experiment? A publicity stunt? A case of mistaken identity? "Are you sure?" Michael asked, his voice uncertain. We're just having a quiet dinner. Nothing special." "That's exactly what we want," Connor said before his mother could respond. He was already moving toward the empty chair beside Emma, drawn by her infectious energy. Victoria watched her son slide into the chair with more enthusiasm than he'd shown for anything in months. The transformation was immediate and startling. Connor's shoulders relaxed. His face brightened, and for the first time all evening, he looked like an actual 6-year-old child instead of a miniature business executive. "I'm Emma," the little girl announced, extending her hand with the formal politeness children use when they're on their best behavior. "And this is my daddy Michael. We're celebrating because I got all A's on my report card." "That's wonderful," Victoria said, and surprised herself by meaning it. She carefully arranged herself in the chair across from Michael, acutely aware of how out of place her designer dress looked in this simple corner of the restaurant. Connor stared at Emma with the fascination of someone discovering a new species. "You got all A's, that's really good. I usually get A's too, but my tutor says I need to work harder on my emotional intelligence scores." Emma blinked. "What's emotional intelligence? I don't really know," Connor admitted, "but apparently I don't have enough of it." Michael and Victoria exchanged glances over their children's heads, a moment of shared parental concern that transcended their vastly different circumstances. "I think you have plenty of emotional intelligence," Emma declared with the certainty of youth. "You knew we looked fun, didn't you?" "That was smart." Connor's smile could have powered the restaurant's chandeliers. Michael found himself studying Victoria as she watched the children's interaction. Up close, without the barrier of magazine pages and television screens, she looked somehow smaller than her reputation suggested. Still intimidating, certainly, but there was something in her eyes as she watched Connor that seemed almost vulnerable. So Michael said, attempting to navigate this surreal situation, "What brings you to Bella Vista tonight?" It was a polite question, the kind of small talk that filled awkward moments. But Victoria's answer surprised him with its honesty. "I wanted Connor to have a nice dinner," she said simply. "We don't do that very often." "Why not?" Emma asked with the directness that only children possess. Victoria paused, clearly unused to such straightforward questions from 6-year-olds. "I work a lot," she said finally. "Oh," Emma nodded seriously. "Daddy works a lot too. 2 jobs, but he still makes time for pasta dinners when I do something good at school." The comment hung in the air, neither accusatory nor judgmental, just a simple statement of fact. But Victoria felt it like a weight settling on her chest. When was the last time she'd celebrated Connor's accomplishments with something as simple as a special dinner? "What kind of work do you do?" Connor asked Michael, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. "I drive deliveries during the day," Michael said unconsciously, straightening his worn shirt. "Food packages, whatever needs to get from one place to another. And at night I do maintenance work for office buildings downtown." "That sounds important," Connor said, seriously. "People need their food and their buildings to work right." The simple acceptance in Connor's voice made Michael's throat tighten unexpectedly. Most people, especially in places like this, looked right through him. His jobs were the kind that made him invisible to the wealthy and powerful. But this little boy spoke to him like his work mattered. "It is important," Victoria said quietly, and Michael looked up in surprise. "Everything that keeps a city running is important." Their conversation was interrupted by a server approaching the table. Not the condescending waiter who had questioned Michael earlier, but a young woman who seemed genuinely pleased by the unusual seating arrangement. "Good evening," she said warmly. "Can I start you with some drinks, chocolate milk?" Emma announced immediately. "It's a celebration, so I get chocolate milk." "Can I have chocolate milk too?" Connor asked, looking at his mother with hopeful eyes. "I know I usually get sparkling water with lime, but—" Victoria found herself nodding before she'd consciously made the decision. "2 chocolate milks," she said to the server. Connor's face practically glowed. Victoria couldn't remember the last time such a small concession had made him so happy. It was chocolate milk, not exactly the kind of sophisticated beverage choice she'd taught him to prefer. But watching his excitement, she wondered when she'd started prioritizing image over joy. Emma immediately launched into a detailed explanation of her report card success, complete with dramatic reenactments of particularly challenging math problems. Connor listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions that showed he was hanging on every word. Michael found himself relaxing despite the surreal circumstances. Emma's enthusiasm was infectious, and Connor's genuine interest in her stories brought out her best storytelling abilities. The children's natural connection seemed to create a bubble of normalcy around their table. But as the evening progressed, Michael became increasingly aware of the attention their unusual group was attracting. Other diners were starting to notice their conversations becoming hushed as they tried to identify the billionaire CEO sitting with what was clearly a working-class family. Mom, Connor said suddenly, "Why is everyone staring at us?" Victoria's jaw tightened as she became aware of the whispered conversations and turned heads. She'd spent years managing her public image, carefully controlling when and how she appeared in public. This spontaneous dinner was definitely not part of any strategic plan. "They're probably just curious," she said carefully. Curious about what, Emma asked, looking around the restaurant with innocent eyes. Michael felt heat rising in his cheeks as he noticed the stares and whispers. He recognized some of the expressions, the kind of looks that said he didn't belong here, that his presence somehow diminished the restaurant's exclusive atmosphere. "Maybe we should," he started to say. "Stay exactly where we are." Victoria finished, her voice carrying a note of steel that made it clear the discussion was over. Connor reached across the table and patted Emma's hand with surprising gentleness. "Don't worry about them," he said with the wisdom of a child who'd grown up in the public eye. "They're just curious because we're having more fun than they are." Emma giggled at this assessment, and Connor's face lit up at her reaction. In that moment, Michael understood why Connor had been so drawn to his daughter. The boy was starving for the kind of uncomplicated happiness that Emma radiated naturally, but their moment of peace was about to be shattered. The first whisper came from a table of impeccably dressed women who'd clearly recognized Victoria. Their conversation was just loud enough to be overheard, their words carrying the sharp edge of judgment. Is that really Victoria Matthews? With that family. How extraordinary. I wonder what statement she's trying to make. Michael's shoulders tensed as he caught fragments of their commentary. He'd dealt with this kind of casual dismissal his entire adult life, but experiencing it in front of Emma was different. His daughter was too young to understand the cruel subtext, but old enough to sense the tension building around their table. Victoria's expression hardened into the mask she wore during hostile board meetings. She was accustomed to being watched, analyzed, and criticized, but having her son exposed to this kind of scrutiny was something she hadn't anticipated. Are those people talking about us? Emma asked, her voice smaller than it had been all evening. People like to talk, Michael said, gently reaching over to squeeze her hand. It doesn't mean anything important. But Connor was old enough to understand more than Emma. His earlier excitement was fading, replaced by the familiar anxiety that seemed to follow him everywhere. Mum, maybe we should go to our real table now. Victoria felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. Connor was retreating back into the shell she'd spent the evening watching him emerge from. We're staying right here, she said firmly. The server approached their table again, this time with a nervous energy that suggested she'd been coached by management about the unusual situation. Mr. Torres, I hate to mention this, but I wanted to make sure. Are you familiar with our menu pricing? Michael's face flushed red. The question was polite enough on the surface, but the implication was crystal clear. The server was questioning whether he could afford to eat here. I can read, Michael said quietly, his voice tight with controlled embarrassment. Connor had been studying the menu with Emma, their heads bent together as she pointed out her favorite dishes. I want the same thing Emma's having, he announced innocently. The pasta with the special sauce. The server's smile became strained. That's our signature truffle pasta, she said to Michael. It's one of our premium selections. Perhaps you'd prefer something from our lighter fare menu. The words hit Michael like a physical blow. Emma looked confused, sensing the tension, but not understanding its source. Connor's excitement dimmed as he picked up on the adult undercurrents swirling around their table. We'll have whatever the children want, Victoria said, her voice dropping to the temperature she reserved for difficult negotiations. Charge everything to my corporate account immediately. The server's demeanor changed instantly, professional warmth replacing the condescending concern. Of course, Mrs. Matthews. I apologize for any confusion. But the damage had been done. Michael's humiliation was written across his face, and Emma had gone quiet, instinctively moving closer to her father's chair. The situation escalated when Mrs. Hamilton, a prominent society figure from a nearby table, decided to make her opinion known. She was the kind of woman who treated restaurants like her personal stage, comfortable using her voice to command attention and express judgment. Victoria Matthews, Mrs. Hamilton's voice carried clearly across the restaurant, pitched just loud enough to be heard by multiple tables. I thought the Matthews dynasty dined with Seattle's elite, not... Well, she gestured dismissively toward Michael. What an interesting choice for your son's introduction to society. The words landed like a slap. Every conversation in their section of the restaurant stopped. Servers paused their rounds. Other diners turned openly to watch the drama unfold. Michael's face went pale. He'd experienced classism before, but never so publicly, never with such deliberate cruelty. His instinct was to gather Emma and leave to remove her from this toxic atmosphere before she could be further hurt by adult prejudice. But before he could move, Emma stood up on her chair, her small chest swelling with indignation that seemed enormous for her 8-year-old frame. My daddy is better than everyone here, she declared, her voice carrying with the clarity of righteous anger. He helps people every day. He fixes things and brings food to people who need it. You're all just sitting here being mean. The restaurant fell into complete silence. Every eye was focused on the small girl, standing defiantly on her chair, protecting her father with the fierce loyalty that only children possess. Connor, inspired by Emma's courage, scrambled to stand beside her. "Mr. Michael is the nicest person I've ever met," he announced, his voice wavering slightly but determined. "He knows how to make people smile. He's better than all the boring people at my house who just talk about money." Victoria felt something crack open in her chest as she watched these two children create their own small army of protection around Michael. Connor had never defended anyone before, had never shown such passionate conviction about anything. The sight of her son standing up for what was right filled her with a pride she'd never experienced during his academic achievements or social accomplishments. Mrs. Hamilton's face flushed with embarrassment at being challenged by children, but her voice remained cutting. How charming. Teaching the children to romanticize poverty. I suppose this is what passes for progressive parenting these days. Michael stood slowly, his dignity intact despite the humiliation. "Emma Connor, please sit down. We should go." "No," Victoria said, her voice carrying the authority that had built an empire. She rose to her feet, and when she spoke, her words were directed at Mrs. Hamilton, but loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "The only thing my son is learning tonight," Victoria said, each word precisely articulated, "is how to recognize genuine character when he sees it. Something that seems to be in short supply at some tables." Mrs. Hamilton's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She'd expected Victoria to distance herself from the embarrassing situation, not defend it. But before anyone could respond, Victoria's personal assistant burst through the restaurant's entrance. Her face pale with panic, phone pressed to her ear. "Ms. Matthews," she called across the restaurant, her professional composure completely shattered. "Emergency board meeting. They're calling for an immediate vote of no confidence. Someone leaked information about your fitness to lead." The words carried across the silent restaurant like a bomb exploding. Every head turned, every conversation stopped, every phone came out to capture what was clearly about to become a very public crisis. Victoria's face went white. Her hand began to tremble almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of the internal earthquake that was reshaping her world in real time. Michael, trained by years of emergency response, immediately recognized the signs of acute stress response. Victoria's breathing had become shallow, her pupils were dilated, and the tremor in her hands was spreading. She was about to collapse. Victoria felt the restaurant spinning around her like a carnival ride gone wrong. The words "vote of no confidence" echoed in her head, combining with the humiliation of the evening and the pressure she'd been carrying for months. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time in front of her son, in front of strangers, in front of cameras that were probably already recording. "They have evidence," her assistant continued, breathlessly oblivious to Victoria's deteriorating condition. "Documentation of erratic behavior, questions about your mental stability. The board is meeting tonight to invoke the fitness clause in your contract." The blood drained from Victoria's face. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, as the room began to tilt dangerously. Years of maintaining perfect control, of never showing weakness, of carrying the weight of a multi-billion-dollar company on her shoulders, finally reached their breaking point. Michael saw it happening before anyone else noticed. His trauma training from years of emergency medical response kicked in instantly, reading the signs that others missed. Victoria's breathing had become rapid and shallow. Her pupils were dilated. The tremor in her hands was spreading up her arms. "Acute stress response leading to hypoglycemic shock," he muttered under his breath, his medical instincts overriding any concern about social boundaries. He moved quickly, grabbing packets of sugar from the coffee station and a glass of water from their table. His hands moved with the precision and speed of someone who'd made life-or-death decisions under fire. "Drink this," he commanded, pressing the glass into Victoria's trembling hands and tearing open 3 sugar packets. All of it right now. Victoria stared at him through the haze of her panic attack, her executive brain struggling to process why the maintenance worker was giving her orders. But something in his voice, the tone of absolute authority that came from years of emergency medicine, cut through her confusion. She drank the sugary water without argument. "Breathe with me." Michael continued, his voice steady and calming. 4 counts in hold for 4, out for 6. Focus on my voice, not the room. The floor staff stood frozen, unsure how to handle the situation. Mrs. Hamilton had gone silent, her earlier smugness replaced by uncomfortable awareness that she was witnessing something far more serious than social drama. Connor pressed against his mother's side, his small face white with terror. "Mom, what's wrong?" Emma, with the intuitive empathy that children possess, quietly moved to Connor's other side and took his hand. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew her new friend was scared. Michael's training took over completely. He knelt beside Victoria's chair, one hand monitoring her pulse while speaking in the calm, measured tones he'd used with wounded soldiers. "Victoria, you're having a stress response. It's temporary. Your blood sugar dropped, but it's stabilizing now. You're safe." The restaurant had gone completely silent, except for the quiet murmur of Michael's voice and the soft clink of Victoria's glass against her teeth as she forced herself to drink. Slowly, color began to return to Victoria's cheeks. Her breathing evened out. The dangerous tremor in her hands subsided to a manageable level. "How did you know?" she whispered, her voice raw with shock and gratitude. "Because I've seen it before," Michael said simply. "In combat zones, emergency rooms, anywhere, people push themselves past their breaking point, trying to hold everything together." Victoria looked at this man who'd just prevented her from collapsing in front of half of Seattle's business elite. The same man Mrs. Hamilton had dismissed as unsuitable company. The same man whose presence at her table had triggered whispers and judgmental stares. He'd saved her without hesitation, without question, without asking for anything in return. Why Victoria's voice cracked with emotion she rarely allowed herself to feel. "Why did you help me? You don't owe me anything. After the way people treated you tonight, you could have just walked away." Michael's gaze shifted to Connor, who was still clinging to his mother's arm with desperate hands. His young face etched with fear that no 6-year-old should have to carry. "Because your son needs his mother," Michael said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his own experience with loss. And no child, regardless of who his parents are, should watch his mother collapse in front of him. The simple humanity of his answer hit Victoria harder than any business crisis she'd ever faced. In her moment of greatest weakness, when her enormous wealth and corporate power were utterly useless, the only person who saw her as a vulnerable human being was the man everyone else had dismissed. Victoria's assistant hovered nearby, phone still pressed to her ear, fielding calls from board members and lawyers and crisis management specialists. The machinery of corporate damage control was already spinning into motion. But sitting in this restaurant, surrounded by the wreckage of her carefully planned evening, Victoria realized something profound. Her empire might be crumbling, her reputation might be in tatters, but this stranger had seen her as a person worth saving. "We need to get you somewhere private," Michael said, helping Victoria to her feet as her legs steadied, away from the cameras and the crowd. Victoria nodded numbly, acutely aware that every phone in the restaurant was probably recording her vulnerability. By tomorrow morning, footage of her breakdown would be trending on every social media platform. "The VIP lounge," she managed to say. "There's a private room in the back." Michael gathered the children while Victoria's assistant cleared a path through the restaurant. Emma and Connor stuck close together, both frightened by the adult crisis they'd witnessed, but finding comfort in each other's presence. As they made their way to the back of the restaurant, Victoria caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Did you see how fast he acted? Where did the janitor learn emergency medicine? He probably just saved the billionaire's life. The private VIP lounge was a sanctuary of leather and mahogany, designed for Seattle's elite to conduct business away from prying eyes. Heavy doors muffled the sounds from the main restaurant, creating a cocoon of relative peace. Victoria sank into one of the plush chairs. Her designer dress wrinkled her perfect makeup, smudged her corporate armor, completely stripped away. For the first time in years, she looked her age. A 34-year-old woman carrying burdens too heavy for anyone to bear alone. Connor and Emma curled up together on a small sofa, whispering quietly, while the adults tried to make sense of what had just happened. Ms. Matthews, the assistant, said urgently, "The board is demanding an immediate response. The media is already calling. We need a statement about your health, your fitness to lead." "Give us 5 minutes," Michael interrupted, his voice carrying unexpected authority. "She needs time to process before making any decisions." The assistant looked confused, uncertain whether to take orders from someone she didn't recognize. But Victoria nodded weakly, grateful for someone else to take control for a moment. As the assistant stepped outside to handle the barrage of calls, Victoria found herself alone with Michael and the children in the quiet sanctuary of the lounge. "You saved my life," she said quietly, the words heavy with meaning she was only beginning to understand. "I just gave you some sugar water," Michael replied, but his eyes were kind. "No," Victoria said, her voice stronger now. "You saw me. Really saw me. Not the CEO, not the target for corporate takeover, not even the charity case everyone thought I was making of your family tonight. You just saw a mother in danger." She looked across the room at Connor, who was showing Emma how to fold paper napkins into origami birds with the kind of patient concentration she'd never seen him display before. "That level of simple humanity," Victoria continued, "it's completely foreign to my world. But it's exactly what my son needed to see." Michael followed her gaze to the children. "He's a good kid, Victoria. Just lonely." The casual use of her first name should have felt presumptuous, but instead it felt like the first genuine human connection she'd experienced in years. "So am I." Victoria admitted the confession slipping out before she could stop it, and in the leather and mahogany sanctuary surrounded by the wreckage of her carefully controlled life, Victoria began to understand that the evening's crisis might actually be the beginning of something she'd never known she needed. The VIP lounge felt like a different world from the chaos of the main restaurant. Soft lighting cast warm shadows across mahogany bookshelves, lined with leather-bound volumes that probably hadn't been opened in years. The thick Persian rug muffled footsteps, and the heavy doors blocked out the corporate warfare that was undoubtedly unfolding just beyond their sanctuary. Emma and Connor had discovered a collection of chess pieces on a side table and were busy creating an elaborate story about a kingdom where pawns could become anything they wanted. Their soft chatter provided a comforting backdrop as the adults tried to process the earthquake that had just reshuffled both their lives. Victoria sat in the oversized leather chair, still pale but steadier now. The sugar had stabilized her blood chemistry, but the emotional aftershock of her public breakdown was just beginning to hit her. "They're trying to destroy me," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd just realized the full scope of the battle ahead. "The board has been looking for any excuse to question my leadership. A public collapse, especially one caught on camera, gives them exactly what they need." Michael studied her face, seeing past the corporate executive to the exhausted woman underneath. "When's the last time you took a real break? Not a working vacation or a strategic retreat, but actual time off." Victoria almost laughed, but the sound came out hollow. "I don't remember." 2 years, 3. When you're running a company this size, taking breaks feels like abandoning your post during a war. And who convinced you that it had to be a war? The question caught Victoria off guard. She'd been raised to see business as combat relationships, as strategies, every interaction as a potential threat to be managed or opportunity to be exploited. Everyone, she said, finally. My father, my business school professors, my board of directors. In my world, showing weakness gets you destroyed. But you weren't weak tonight, Michael said gently. You were human. There's a difference. Connor looked up from his chess piece kingdom. Mom, are you in trouble at work? Victoria's throat tightened. How could she explain corporate coups and hostile takeovers to a 6-year-old? Some people think I'm not doing a good enough job, she said carefully. That's stupid, Connor said with the blunt honesty of childhood. You work harder than anyone. You're always working. The innocent observation hit Victoria like a physical blow. Her son's entire understanding of her worth was based on how much time she spent working. Not the time she spent with him, not the moments of joy or connection they might have shared. Just work. Michael must have seen the pain in her expression because he smoothly redirected Connor's attention. Hey buddy, want to show me more about your chess kingdom? I bet Emma would like to hear about the magical pawns. As the children returned to their play, Michael turned back to Victoria. You said the board is questioning your fitness to lead? What kind of evidence could they possibly have? Victoria's laugh was bitter. In corporate America, evidence is whatever the loudest voices say it is. They'll point to tonight's collapse as proof of mental instability. They'll probably commission psychological evaluations, bring in medical experts to question my ability to handle stress. And what's really behind this attack? The question was asked with the kind of tactical awareness that made Victoria look at Michael more closely. His phrasing, his immediate grasp of the political undercurrents, his calm assessment of the situation, none of it matched her assumptions about a maintenance worker's skill set. Richard Blackwood, she said finally. Head of operations. He's been positioning himself as my successor for months, building alliances, planting doubts about my leadership style. And tonight's crisis was perfectly timed to support his narrative. It wasn't a question, and Michael's instant understanding of the strategic elements made Victoria study him with new eyes. You're very perceptive for someone who drives deliveries and mops floors. Michael's smile was gentle without resentment. People tend to underestimate the invisible workers. We see more than you might think. There was something in his tone, a depth of experience, that didn't match his current circumstances. Before Victoria could pursue the thought, Connor appeared at Michael's elbow with a paper napkin folded into the shape of a bird. Look what Emma taught me, Connor said, his face bright with accomplishment. She says if you make a wish and fold it into the paper, the bird carries it up to heaven. That's beautiful, Michael said, accepting the origami bird with the kind of reverence that made it clear he understood how precious the gift was to Connor. What did you wish for? Victoria asked her son. Connor's expression grew serious. I wished that Uncle Michael could stay with us, forever and ever. The simple declaration made Victoria's chest tight. Connor had known Michael for less than 2 hours, but he'd already formed the kind of attachment she'd never seen him display toward any of his tutors and nannies, or the revolving door of adults who managed his daily life. Uncle Michael? She asked quietly. He likes to be called that? Emma chimed in from across the room. All my friends at school call him Uncle Michael when he picks me up. He says family isn't just about who you're born with, it's about who chooses to love you. The words hit Victoria with unexpected force. When was the last time anyone had chosen to love Connor without being paid to care for him? Victoria's assistant knocked on the lounge door, then entered with an expression that suggested the news wasn't good. Ms. Matthews, I have Richard Blackwood on line 1. He's demanding to speak with you immediately about tonight's incident, and there are already 3 news trucks outside the restaurant. Michael stood immediately. We should go. This media attention isn't good for the children, where Victoria asked, suddenly realizing she had no safe haven. Her penthouse apartment would be surrounded by reporters within the hour. Her office was enemy territory. Every hotel in the city would leak her location to the highest bidder. "My apartment," Michael said without hesitation. "It's not much, but it's private. No one will look for you there." Victoria stared at him. The idea of Seattle's most powerful CEO hiding out in a maintenance worker's apartment was so absurd it almost made sense. It was the last place anyone would expect to find her. "I couldn't impose Mom," Connor interrupted. "Please, I want to go with Uncle Michael and Emma." Victoria looked at her son's pleading face, then at Emma, who was nodding encouragingly, then at Michael, who was offering sanctuary without asking for anything in return. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria made a decision based purely on what felt right instead of what looked strategically sound. "Okay," she said. "Let's go." As they prepared to leave through the restaurant's back exit to avoid the media crowd, Victoria's assistant continued fielding phone calls from board members, lawyers, and crisis management specialists. "Tell them I'll respond tomorrow," Victoria instructed. "Tonight I'm unavailable for comment." "But Ms. Matthews, they're demanding immediate." "Tomorrow," Victoria repeated, her voice carrying the authority that had built an empire. As they slipped out through the restaurant's service entrance, Victoria caught a glimpse of the news trucks assembled out front, reporters already broadcasting live about the billionaire CEO's mysterious collapse and dramatic rescue by an unknown maintenance worker. By morning, the story would be everywhere. But tonight, for the first time in years, Victoria wasn't thinking about damage control or strategic responses. Tonight she was thinking about her son's smile and the way a stranger's kindness had saved more than just her blood sugar level. Michael's apartment building sat in a working-class neighborhood about 20 minutes from downtown Seattle. The brick structure showed its age, probably built in the 1960s, with narrow hallways and the kind of sturdy construction that lasted decades without being beautiful. Victoria's heels clicked against linoleum floors as they climbed to the third floor, Connor's hand firmly clasped in hers. "It's not fancy," Michael said. "Unlocking apartment 3B, but it's home." The space that greeted them was small, but immaculately clean. A living room that doubled as Emma's homework area, with her art projects carefully displayed on the refrigerator like masterpieces in a gallery. Furniture that had clearly been purchased second-hand but maintained with care. Photographs everywhere. Emma blowing out birthday candles, father and daughter, at a pumpkin patch school concerts and soccer games, and ordinary moments made precious by love. Connor stopped in the doorway, taking in the cozy apartment with the wonder of someone discovering an alien civilization. Victoria's penthouse was 10 times this size, filled with museum-quality art and furniture that cost more than most people's cars. But Connor had never looked at their home with the kind of fascination he was showing now. "It's so warm," Connor whispered, and Victoria realized he was right. Despite the modest furnishings and small spaces, Michael's apartment radiated the kind of comfort that money couldn't buy. Emma immediately took Connor on a tour, proudly showing him her bedroom with its twin bed covered in stuffed animals, her bookshelf overstuffed with library books and worn paperbacks, her art corner where she created the masterpieces that covered the refrigerator. "This is where Daddy reads to me every night," Emma explained, pointing to a reading chair positioned next to her bed. "He does all the voices for the characters. He's really good at dragon voices." Connor's eyes went wide. "Your daddy reads to you every night." "Every single night," Emma confirmed. "Even when he's super tired from work. He says stories are the most important part of the day because they help you dream good dreams." Victoria felt something twist in her chest. Connor had a library of educational books in his room, carefully selected by his tutors to promote cognitive development and academic advancement. But when was the last time someone had simply read him a story for the joy of it? "Do you want to hear a story tonight?" Michael asked Connor, who was staring at Emma's reading corner with obvious longing. "Could I?" Connor's voice was so small, so hopeful, that Victoria had to turn away to hide the tears threatening to spill. "Of course, buddy. But first, let's get everyone settled. Michael moved through his tiny kitchen with efficient grace, preparing hot chocolate and grilled cheese sandwiches, comfort food that Victoria hadn't eaten since she was Connor's age. She found herself watching him work, noting the way he moved with quiet competence, how he naturally included Connor in simple tasks like stirring the hot chocolate. Uncle Michael Connor said suddenly, "Why do you live here instead of in a big house like ours?" Michael paused in his sandwich preparation, considering how to answer without making Connor feel guilty about his family's wealth. "I live here because it's all we need, and it lets me spend more time with Emma instead of working extra hours to pay for a bigger place." O'Connor said, processing this concept. "So you chose time over space exactly." Victoria listened to this exchange with growing understanding. Everything about Michael's life was deliberately chosen to prioritize presence over prestige, connection over accumulation. It was the opposite of every decision she'd made since Connor was born. They'd been in the apartment for about an hour when everything changed. Connor, who had been animated and happy, suddenly went very still. His face paled, and his small hands began to tremble as he pressed them against his chest. "I can't breathe," he whispered, his voice tight with panic. Victoria immediately went into crisis mode, the same focused intensity she brought to boardroom emergencies. "Connor, what's wrong? Are you sick? Do you need your inhaler?" But Connor recoiled from her touch, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "Mom, what if you get sick again? What if you disappear like the nannies said?" The words hit Victoria like ice water. "What nannies? What did they say? They said you work too much and one day you won't come back." Connor gasped between panicked breaths. "And tonight you almost fell down and I got scared. And now I can't stop being scared." Michael immediately recognized what was happening. He's having a panic attack triggered by watching you collapse earlier. The fear is manifesting as physical symptoms. Connor's breathing became more erratic, his small body rigid with terror. Victoria tried to reach for him, but her son shrank away from her touch, clearly associating her presence with the source of his fear. "I don't know how to help him," Victoria said desperately. "I don't know what to do when he's like this." It was a moment of complete parental helplessness, the kind that strips away all pretense and reveals the raw terror of being responsible for someone else's well-being. Michael knelt down to Connor's level, his voice taking on the calm, steady tone he'd used during Victoria's medical crisis. "Connor, look at me. Focus on my voice, not the scary thoughts." He held out his hands, palms up in a non-threatening gesture. "Can you feel my hands? They're warm, right? And steady. Nothing bad is happening right now in this moment." Connor's panicked gaze fixed on Michael's face, seeking anchor in the storm of his fear. "Good," Michael continued. "Now we're going to breathe together. Watch my chest. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 6. Just like your mum did earlier when she was scared." Michael demonstrated the breathing pattern, exaggerating his chest movements so Connor could follow along. Emma, understanding instinctively that her friend was in distress, quietly moved to sit beside Connor, offering her presence without overwhelming him. "You're safe," Michael said softly. "Your mom is safe. I'm right here, Emma's right here, and we're not going anywhere." Slowly, gradually, Connor's breathing began to match Michael's rhythm. The terrible rigidity in his small body started to ease. "That's it," Michael encouraged. "You're doing great. Can you tell me 3 things you can see in this room?" Connor's voice was shaky but present. "Emma's stuffed elephant. The picture of you and Emma at the beach. The blue blanket on the couch. Perfect. Now 2 things you can hear. The heater turning on. Emma's breathing. And 1 thing you can feel." Connor reached out tentatively and touched Michael's shirt. "Your shirt. It's soft. And you smell like safety." Michael's eyes filled with tears at the unconscious admission. "That's exactly right, buddy. You're completely safe. Victoria watched this entire exchange from across the room, tears streaming down her face. Her son was experiencing a level of terror she'd never recognized, never addressed, never known how to handle. But Michael had guided Connor through the crisis with the kind of intuitive understanding that came from genuine emotional intelligence. When Connor finally relaxed completely against Michael's chest, surrendering to the comfort being offered, Victoria saw something that broke her heart and opened it at the same time. Her son trusted this virtual stranger more than he trusted her. "How did you know what to do?" she asked quietly. "Combat trauma training," Michael said, still holding Connor close. "Panic attacks are panic attacks, whether you're a soldier or a 6-year-old. The techniques are the same." Connor's voice was muffled against Michael's shirt. "Uncle Michael, you smell like my daddy should smell." The innocent words hit Victoria with devastating clarity. Connor was expressing a need she'd never recognized, never thought to fill. He needed masculine energy, paternal comfort, the kind of grounding presence that had nothing to do with wealth or status and everything to do with simply showing up. Mum, Connor said, lifting his head to look at her with eyes that seemed older than his 6 years. "Why don't you know how to help me when I'm scared?" Victoria felt the question like a knife between her ribs. Not because Connor meant to hurt her, but because his need for an answer was so genuine, so desperate. "I don't know, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I want to learn." Michael looked up at Victoria, seeing a mother's pain and recognition. "It's not about knowing the techniques," he said gently. "It's about being present with the fear instead of trying to fix it immediately." Connor nodded seriously. Uncle Michael didn't try to make the scared go away. He just sat with me while I was scared. That made it smaller. Victoria sank into Michael's reading chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd failed to provide for her son. All the money in the world couldn't buy the kind of presence Michael had just offered Connor. "Will you read us that story now?" Connor asked, still curled against Michael's chest like a baby bird seeking warmth. "Absolutely," Michael said, reaching for one of Emma's favorite books. As Michael began reading in his warm, expressive voice, creating different characters and sound effects that made both children giggle, Victoria watched her son transform. The fear melted away, replaced by wonder and security. And for the first time since Connor was born, Victoria began to understand the difference between providing for her child and actually raising him. Victoria's phone had been buzzing relentlessly for the past hour, each notification bringing news that made her situation more precarious. She'd finally put the device on silent, but the small screen continued to light up, with calls from board members, reporters, and lawyers. Emma and Connor had fallen asleep during Michael's third story, curled together on the living room sofa under a soft blue blanket. The sight of her son sleeping peacefully, his face relaxed in a way she rarely saw at home, made Victoria's chest ache with a mixture of gratitude and regret. "He's never slept that easily," she said quietly, careful not to wake the children. "At home he has night terrors, anxiety about the next day's schedule. His therapist says it's performance anxiety related to academic pressure." Michael looked up from the financial documents Victoria's assistant had forwarded to his email address. Even in the midst of corporate warfare, his attention kept returning to the children's well-being. "Maybe the pressure isn't coming from school," he said gently. Victoria knew he was right, but the implications were almost too painful to acknowledge. She'd structured Connor's entire life around achievement and advancement, believing that success would protect him from the kind of vulnerability she'd experienced in her own childhood. Instead, she'd created a different kind of trauma. "Ms. Matthews," her assistant's voice came through the laptop speaker during their video call. "I have Richard Blackwood demanding an immediate conference call. He's claiming the board has enough votes to remove you pending a psychological evaluation. He's moving fast." Michael observed his tone, carrying the kind of tactical awareness that made Victoria study him more closely. Corporate coups require momentum. The longer you have to organize a response, the weaker his position becomes. Victoria found herself leaning forward, interested in Michael's analysis, despite the chaos surrounding them. "You think like a strategist." "I think like someone who's seen hostile operations before." There was something in Michael's voice, a depth of experience that went beyond delivering packages and mopping floors. But before Victoria could pursue the thought, her assistant's voice cut through their conversation. "There's something else," the assistant said, her voice tight with concern. "The video from tonight is trending on social media. But it's not just the footage of your episode. Someone had a camera positioned perfectly to capture the whole thing. The timing, the angle, the way it's edited to make you look unstable. It's too professional to be coincidental." Michael went very still. "Run that by me again." Someone was filming before Victoria collapsed. The footage starts several minutes before the medical crisis. It captures the conversation with Mrs. Hamilton, the confrontation with the waiter. Everything leading up to the moment Victoria went down. Victoria felt ice forming in her stomach. That means someone knew what was going to happen. Someone planned this. Or created it, Michael said grimly. He pulled out his own phone and began searching for the viral video. When he found it, his expression grew dark. "Victoria, look at this. The person filming anticipated your collapse. The camera angle changes right before you start showing symptoms. This isn't random social media footage. This is surveillance." Victoria watched the video with growing horror. It showed her at her worst moment, but more than that, it was edited to emphasize every sign of instability while downplaying the medical nature of her crisis. The footage made her look erratic, unstable, unfit to lead. "Richard Blackwood," she whispered. "He orchestrated this entire evening. Explain." Michael said, his voice taking on the crisp authority of someone accustomed to tactical briefings. Victoria's mind raced as she connected the pieces. "The timing is too perfect. Richard knew I was planning a public dinner with Connor tonight. It was on my calendar shared with senior staff for security planning. And he needed more than just a boardroom coup to remove you." Michael continued, following her logic. "He needed public justification, something dramatic enough to convince external shareholders that you're unfit to lead. The medical crisis gave him exactly what he needed, but..." Victoria paused, a terrible possibility forming in her mind. What if it wasn't coincidental? Michael's expression grew grim. "Tell me about your assistant, the one who burst into the restaurant with the emergency news. Sarah, she's been with the company for 8 months. Richard recommended her for the position. Said she had excellent organizational skills and absolute discretion. And she arrived at the restaurant at exactly the right moment to trigger your stress response with news of the board meeting." Victoria's blood ran cold. "You think she's working for Richard?" "I think Richard Blackwood planted your assistant to gather intelligence and create opportunities for exactly this kind of attack. Tonight's crisis wasn't an accident. It was an operation. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Sarah had access to Victoria's medical information, her stress levels, her daily schedule. She would have known that delivering news of a corporate coup in a public setting would trigger a severe stress response. The video, the timing, the medical crisis," Victoria said slowly. "Richard didn't just take advantage of my weakness. He engineered it." Michael's phone rang, interrupting their analysis. He glanced at the caller ID and his face went pale. "It's my sister," he said. "She only calls when there's an emergency." Victoria gestured for him to take the call, but as Michael listened to his sister's voice, his expression grew increasingly concerned. "When did this happen?" he asked. "Are you sure it was them?" "Okay, keep the doors locked. I'll call you back." He hung up and turned to Victoria with grim determination. Richard Blackwood's people just visited my sister's house, asking questions about me. They claimed to be conducting a background check for a news story about tonight's incident. They're investigating you. They're looking for leverage. Something to discredit my credibility as a witness to your medical crisis. Victoria felt a surge of protective anger that surprised her with its intensity. I won't let them drag you into this corporate war. Too late, Michael said grimly. I'm already in it. The question is whether we fight back or let them destroy both our lives. Connor stirred on the sofa, mumbling in his sleep. Both adults immediately lowered their voices, but the interruption reminded them of what was really at stake. If Richard succeeds in removing you from the company, Michael said quietly, what happens to Connor? Victoria's throat tightened. He becomes the heir to an empire controlled by someone who engineered his mother's destruction. Richard will use Connor as a symbol of stability, a way to legitimize his leadership while keeping the Matthews name on the company. And Connor will grow up believing his mother was weak, unstable, unfit to lead. The thought was unbearable. Victoria had built her entire life around providing Connor with security and opportunity. The idea that her son might inherit her legacy while believing she was a failure was worse than losing the company itself. We have to stop him, Victoria said, her voice carrying the steel that had built an empire. But I don't know how. Richard has the votes, the evidence, the narrative. By tomorrow morning I'll be removed from leadership and Connor will be raised by trustees who think I'm mentally unstable. Michael stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline where Victoria's corporate headquarters dominated the downtown landscape. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that made Victoria listen intently. You're thinking about this like a business problem, he said. But it's not a business problem. It's a military operation. Richard is conducting psychological warfare using timing intelligence and strategic manipulation to achieve his objectives. And how do you fight psychological warfare? Michael turned back to her, and for the first time that evening, Victoria saw something in his eyes that went beyond kindness and competence. She saw the kind of tactical intelligence that came from real experience with real conflicts. You turn the enemy's weapons against them, he said simply. Richard used your compassion and your medical vulnerability as weapons. We use his arrogance and his overconfidence against him. We, Victoria asked. Michael looked at Connor's sleeping form, then back at Victoria. That little boy needs his mother to be strong. Not because she never shows weakness, but because she knows how to fight for what matters. Victoria felt something shift inside her chest. A recognition of alliance that went deeper than business strategy. What do you need to know? Everything Michael said. Richard's timeline, his allies on the board, the specific evidence he claims to have against you. But first, I need you to trust me with something you're not going to want to share. Victoria looked at this man who'd saved her life twice in one evening, once from medical crisis, once from complete despair, and made a decision that went against every instinct she'd developed in 20 years of corporate warfare. Okay, she said. What do you need to know? I need to know exactly who Michael Torres really is, he said quietly. Because the maintenance worker who mops your building's floors isn't qualified to take on a corporate conspiracy. But the person I used to be, he might be able to help. Victoria felt her breath catch as she realized that Michael had been holding back just as much of himself as she had. Who were you? She asked. Michael looked at the children sleeping peacefully on his sofa, then back at Victoria. I was a military intelligence officer, specializing in psychological operations. I spent 8 years identifying and dismantling enemy propaganda campaigns in combat zones. The revelation hit Victoria like lightning. No wonder Michael had read the situation so clearly. No wonder his tactical analysis was so precise. Why are you driving deliveries and mopping floors? Because after my wife died, I couldn't handle being responsible for other people's lives anymore. I chose invisibility over influence, presence over power." He paused, looking at Connor again. "But watching that little boy tonight, seeing how much he needs you to be strong, maybe it's time to remember how to fight." Victoria felt hope kindle in her chest for the first time since the restaurant crisis began. "Can we win?" Michael's smile was sharp and confident. Richard Blackwood just picked a fight with someone who dismantled propaganda networks for a living. And he made the mistake of threatening a family I care about. So what's our first move? "We give Richard exactly what he's expecting," Michael said. "A complete surrender. And while he's celebrating his victory, we document every piece of evidence that proves tonight was an orchestrated attack." Victoria looked at Michael with new understanding. The gentle man who'd comforted her son and saved her from medical crisis was also a tactical expert who'd spent years fighting much more dangerous enemies than corporate executives. "How long do we have?" "The board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. That gives us about 18 hours to prove that Richard Blackwood committed corporate espionage, medical assault, and fraud. And if we can't prove it—" Michael looked at Connor, sleeping peacefully, then back at Victoria. "Then we make sure Connor grows up knowing his mother fought for him, even if she lost." Victoria felt tears burn her eyes. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't fighting alone. Dawn was breaking over Seattle when Victoria made a decision that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. She looked at Michael, who was quietly making breakfast, while Emma and Connor whispered excitedly about their plans to build the world's greatest blanket fort, and realized that she didn't want this feeling to end. "Michael," she said carefully, "would you and Emma like to come to our house today? Connor's been asking since he woke up, and honestly, I'd like to show you both where we live." It was a simple invitation, but they all understood it meant something more. Victoria Matthews didn't bring maintenance workers home to her mansion. She didn't expose her private life to people outside her carefully controlled circle. This was uncharted territory. Michael hesitated, glancing around his modest apartment. "Victoria, your world and mine. They're pretty different. I don't want Emma to feel out of place." "Please, Uncle Michael." Connor appeared at Michael's elbow with the kind of desperate hope that made refusal impossible. "I want to show Emma my room and the garden and the library with all the books." Emma bounced excitedly beside Connor. "I love libraries, and I've never seen a mansion before." Victoria found herself smiling at Emma's enthusiasm. The little girl approached the prospect of visiting enormous wealth with the same wonder she'd shown for the restaurant's chandeliers, as if it was simply another adventure to explore. "Besides," Victoria added quietly, "I think I need to see my own home through fresh eyes, through Emma's eyes." An hour later, they were driving through the hills above Seattle in Victoria's car, Connor and Emma chattering in the back seat about everything they could see through the windows. Victoria found herself stealing glances at Michael, who was taking in the increasingly expensive neighborhoods with quiet observation. Having second thoughts, she asked, "Just trying to understand how someone who grew up with all this became so disconnected from simple happiness," Michael said gently. Victoria considered the question as they passed through the private gates of her community. "When you have everything handed to you, you start to believe that nothing has real value unless you fight for it. I think I forgot that Connor wasn't a business challenge to be solved." The Matthews estate sat on 5 acres of meticulously landscaped grounds overlooking Puget Sound. The house itself was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all clean lines and soaring glass, designed to impress rather than comfort. Victoria pulled into the circular driveway and watched Emma's reaction through the rearview mirror. "Wow!" Emma breathed, her nose pressed against the window. "It looks like a castle made of glass." "It's not a castle," Connor said seriously. But it's really big, and sometimes it echoes when you talk loud. Michael helped the children out of the car, his expression thoughtful as he took in the mansion's impressive facade. It's beautiful, he said diplomatically. It's also completely empty most of the time, Victoria admitted. I bought it thinking Connor would grow into it, that we'd fill it with family and friends and laughter. Instead, it's become a museum where we happen to live. The interior was as impressive as the exterior. Soaring ceilings, original artwork furniture that belonged in design magazines. But as they walked through the formal living room and dining room, Victoria began to see her home through Michael and Emma's eyes. It was beautiful, but it wasn't warm. Impressive, but not inviting. The kind of space designed for entertaining business associates rather than raising a child. Emma walked through the rooms with wide-eyed wonder, occasionally reaching out to touch a sculpture or painting before catching herself and pulling her hand back. You can touch things, Victoria said gently. Nothing here is more important than making you feel welcome. Connor immediately grabbed Emma's hand. Come see my room. It's upstairs and it has its own bathroom and everything. As the children ran up the marble staircase, their footsteps and laughter echoing through the cavernous space. Victoria found herself walking beside Michael in comfortable silence. Connor was right, Michael observed. It does echo. The acoustics are terrible for a family. Victoria agreed, but perfect for making sure everyone knows when important people arrive. They found the children in Connor's bedroom, which was large enough to house Michael's entire living room. The space was immaculately organized, filled with educational toys and books arranged with museum-like precision. Emma stood in the center of the room, turning slowly to take it all in. Connor, she said finally, your room is bigger than our whole apartment. But where do you play? It was an innocent question, but it hit Victoria like a lightning bolt. Connor's room was designed for learning and development, but there was no space that invited imagination or creativity. I usually play on my computer, Connor said, gesturing toward an expensive educational gaming system. Or with my building blocks at the table. Emma walked over to a corner where pristine toys sat in perfect rows on custom shelving. Can we mess these up? She asked hopefully. I want to build something with you. We're not supposed to make messes, Connor said automatically, then looked at his mother with questioning eyes. Are we, Mom? Victoria felt her heart break a little more. Today you can make all the messes you want. What followed was a revelation. Within minutes, Emma had Connor pulling toys off shelves, building elaborate constructions on the floor, creating the kind of imaginative chaos that Victoria realized she'd been unconsciously discouraging for years. Look, Uncle Michael, Emma called from where she and Connor were constructing what appeared to be a spaceship made from blocks and stuffed animals. We're building a rocket to take everyone to the moon. Michael knelt down beside their creation, asking serious questions about the spaceship's navigation system and fuel capacity. His complete engagement with their game drew laughter and increasingly elaborate explanations from both children. Victoria watched from the doorway, mesmerized by the transformation taking place in Connor's room. Her son was animated, creative, genuinely happy in a way she'd never seen before. And it was happening because someone was playing with him instead of teaching him something. Mrs. Victoria Emma's voice drew her attention. Can we see the kitchen? Connor says you have a refrigerator that makes ice in shapes. Of course, sweetheart. The kitchen was Victoria's pride, a professional-grade space designed for the catering staff who handled her entertaining. Marble countertops, commercial appliances, enough space to prepare meals for 50 people. But as Emma explored the massive room, her questions revealed truths Victoria had never considered. Where do you eat breakfast? Emma asked, looking around the formal space. There's a breakfast nook by the window, Victoria said, gesturing toward a small table that seated 2. But where does Connor sit when you have breakfast together? The question hung in the air. Victoria realized with growing shame that she and Connor rarely ate breakfast together. He had his meals prepared by the housekeeper, while Victoria reviewed emails and prepared for her day. "We usually eat at different times," Victoria admitted quietly. Emma's face fell slightly. "Oh, that sounds lonely." Michael intervened smoothly before the conversation could become more painful. "Hey, what do you say we make lunch together? I bet this kitchen has everything we need to create something oozing." "Can we really?" Connor asked, his eyes bright with excitement. "I've never cooked before. Everyone should know how to make at least one special dish," Michael said, rolling up his sleeves. "Today you're going to learn the Torres family's secret grilled cheese recipe." What followed was the most life the mansion's kitchen had seen in years. Michael guided Connor and Emma through the process of making grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, turning simple cooking into an adventure filled with laughter and learning. Victoria found herself drawn into the activity, despite her complete lack of cooking experience. Michael patiently showed her how to butter bread evenly, how to know when the pan was the right temperature, how to flip sandwiches without burning them. "This is harder than it looks," Victoria said, concentrating intensely on her grilling technique. "That's because you're thinking about it like a business problem," Michael said with gentle humor. "Food is about feeling, not strategy." When they finally sat down to eat their homemade lunch at the kitchen island, Victoria realized something profound had happened. For the first time since moving into the mansion, the space felt like a home. Connor couldn't stop talking about the cooking process, analyzing every step with the enthusiasm usually reserved for academic achievements. Emma basked in the praise for her sandwich-flipping skills, and Victoria found herself laughing at Michael's stories about Emma's previous cooking adventures. Uncle Michael Connor said as they finished eating, "Can we do this every day?" The innocent question hung in the air, loaded with implications that all the adults understood. Connor wasn't just asking about cooking. He was asking about feeling this happy, this connected, this much like a real family. "I think," Victoria said carefully, "that we should do this as often as possible." After lunch, Victoria gave them a tour of the rest of the mansion: the library with its first edition collections, the home theater, the game room filled with expensive equipment that Connor barely used. But it was the garden that truly captured everyone's attention. The backyard was a masterpiece of landscape design, with terraced levels leading down to a private dock on Puget Sound. Emma immediately ran toward the water, Connor close behind her, both of them drawn by the freedom of open space. Victoria and Michael walked more slowly, following the children's excited exploration, while staying close enough to ensure their safety. "It's beautiful," Michael said, taking in the view of the Sound and the Olympic Mountains beyond. "It's also completely wasted," Victoria replied. "Connor and I never spend time out here. I bought this place thinking it would be perfect for entertaining, but I never considered what it would be like to actually live in it." They settled on a bench overlooking the water while the children explored the dock under their watchful eyes. Emma was teaching Connor how to skip stones, her patient instruction and his determined practice, creating exactly the kind of scene Victoria had imagined when she'd bought the property. "Thank you," Victoria said quietly. "For what?" "For showing me what I was missing, for helping Connor laugh like that, for making my house feel like a home, even if it's just for today." Michael was quiet for a moment, watching the children's joy. Emma's never had space like this to play in, and Connor's never had someone his age to share it with. Maybe they're both getting something they needed. And what are we getting? Michael looked at Victoria, seeing the vulnerability she was allowing herself to show. Maybe we're getting a glimpse of what family actually feels like. As the afternoon sun began to set over the Sound painting, the sky in shades of pink and gold, Victoria found herself reluctant to let the day end. The children were playing a game they'd invented involving counting sailboats and making wishes on seaplanes, their laughter carrying across the water. Victoria said, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I don't want you to go home tonight. He looked at her with surprise, and something that might have been hope. I mean, all of you, Victoria clarified quickly. Emma and Connor are so happy together, and honestly, this is the first time this house has felt like a real home. Would you consider staying? Just for tonight? Michael studied her face, searching for the motivation behind the invitation. Victoria, are you sure? Your world and mine. Our worlds, Victoria interrupted gently, seem to work better together than apart, as if summoned by their conversation. Connor and Emma ran up from the dock, both slightly breathless and completely exhilarated. Mom Connor called. Can Emma and Uncle Michael sleep over? Please, we want to build a blanket fort in the library and watch movies and tell ghost stories. Emma joined her voice to Connor's plea. Please, Uncle Michael, I promise I'll be good, and I want to see if Connor's house has as many echoes at night as it does during the day. Victoria and Michael looked at each other over the children's heads, both of them recognizing that they'd reached a turning point. This wasn't just about one evening anymore. This was about choosing connection over safety, vulnerability over control. What do you think Uncle Michael? Victoria asked, using Emma's name for him deliberately. Ready for a sleepover adventure? Michael's smile was answer enough. As they walked back toward the mansion, Connor's hand in Victoria's and Emma skipping beside Michael. Victoria realized that she'd spent years trying to give Connor everything money could buy, while missing the one thing he actually needed: a family. Tonight, for the first time, they felt like one. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. at Matthews Industries headquarters, but by noon, the building was already surrounded by news trucks and protesters. Some carried signs supporting Victoria's leadership, others demanding corporate accountability. Social media had turned her collapse into a symbol of everything wrong with executive stress culture. Victoria stood at her office window, 40 floors above the chaos, watching the circus with grim determination. She'd barely slept, spending the night planning strategy with Michael, while Connor and Emma built blanket forts and told stories that echoed through the mansion's vast rooms. You don't have to do this, Michael said quietly, joining her at the window. He'd insisted on coming to the office, despite Victoria's protests that it wasn't safe for him. We have enough evidence to expose Richard's conspiracy through legal channels. Victoria touched the folder containing their documented proof. Digital trails showing Sarah's communications with Richard, the professional video equipment used to capture last night's footage, medical records proving Victoria's collapse was stress-induced rather than indicating chronic instability. Legal channels take months, Victoria said. Connor doesn't have months. If Richard succeeds today, he'll spend the next year dismantling everything my family built, while convincing the world that I was unfit to lead. And if we fail, Victoria turned from the window to face Michael, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. Then Connor grows up knowing his mother fought for him. The boardroom was packed with 37 board members, their faces reflecting various degrees of concern, curiosity, and barely concealed ambition. Richard Blackwood sat at the far end of the polished table, his expression confident as he reviewed his presentation materials. Victoria entered with Michael beside her, causing a ripple of whispered commentary throughout the room. Richard's eyebrows rose at the sight of the maintenance worker accompanying Seattle's most powerful CEO, but his smile remained smugly confident. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard began before Victoria could reach her seat. Before we begin today's proceedings, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Victoria's companion is not a board member and has no business being present during sensitive corporate discussions. Mr. Torres is here as my strategic consultant, Victoria replied calmly, taking her seat at the head of the table. Given the nature of today's accusations, I believe his insights will be valuable. Strategic consultant Richard's laugh was condescending. Victoria, this man mops our floors. Whatever emotional support you need should be provided by qualified professionals, not— Careful, Richard. Michael's voice cut through the room with quiet authority. You might want to be more thoughtful about your assumptions. There was something in Michael's tone that made several board members sit up straighter. Richard's confident expression faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. Very well, Richard said, activating the presentation screen. Let's begin with why we're here. Last night, Victoria Matthews suffered a very public breakdown that has raised serious questions about her fitness to lead this company. The screen filled with carefully edited footage from the restaurant, showing Victoria's collapse while downplaying the circumstances that triggered it. Richard had crafted a narrative that made her appear unstable and erratic. Furthermore, Richard continued, we have documentation showing increasingly erratic decision-making, missed meetings due to alleged medical issues, and a pattern of emotional volatility that threatens the company's stability. Victoria watched board members' faces as they absorbed Richard's presentation. Some looked concerned, others skeptical. A few seemed to have already made up their minds. When Richard finished his character assassination, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to Victoria, waiting for her response. Thank you, Richard, Victoria said calmly. That was a very compelling presentation. Professional video editing, careful selection of evidence, strategic timing. It almost looks like you spent weeks preparing for this moment. I've been documenting concerns about your leadership for months, Richard replied smoothly. Have you? Victoria gestured to Michael, who stood and approached the presentation screen. Ladies and gentlemen. Michael began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to briefing military commanders. What you just witnessed wasn't a presentation about corporate leadership. It was a textbook example of psychological warfare. The room stirred with interest and confusion. Michael's bearing had transformed completely. Gone was any trace of the humble maintenance worker replaced by someone who commanded attention and respect. Mr. Torres has an interesting background, Victoria said. He's a former military intelligence officer who specialized in identifying and dismantling enemy propaganda operations. Richard meets someone who dismantled networks far more sophisticated than yours. Richard's face had gone pale, but he rallied quickly. This is absurd. Victoria, you're so desperate to avoid accountability that you're creating conspiracy theories. Let's test that theory. Michael interrupted, activating his own presentation materials. The video you just showed was filmed with professional equipment positioned in advance. Not smartphone footage, but broadcast quality material shot from multiple angles. The screen filled with technical analysis of the restaurant footage, showing metadata that proved the video's professional origins. Furthermore, Michael continued, the timing of last night's crisis was precisely orchestrated. Victoria received news of this board meeting at the exact moment when public humiliation would trigger maximum stress response. That's a coincidence? Richard began. Delivered by an assistant you personally recommended for hire, Michael said, displaying employment records. Sarah Henderson, who has been providing you with detailed reports on Victoria's schedule medical information and stress levels for 8 months. Richard's confident expression was cracking. You can't prove— Actually, I can. Michael displayed a series of email communications between Richard and Sarah, documenting their coordination of last night's attack. Sarah kept excellent records, including her instructions to film Victoria's collapse and ensure maximum media coverage. The boardroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Richard stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger and panic. This is fabricated evidence, he shouted. Victoria is so unstable she's creating elaborate paranoid fantasies to avoid taking responsibility for her mental breakdown. Richard, Victoria said quietly. You just made a critical error. She activated another screen showing Richard's own email communications. You see, while you were orchestrating my downfall, you forgot that our IT security systems log all internal communications, including the messages where you refer to last night as the operation and celebrate its success. The room fell silent as board members read Richard's own words condemning him. His plan to destroy Victoria, his celebration of her public humiliation, his detailed coordination with Sarah, all documented in his own communications. "You didn't just attack me," Victoria continued, her voice gaining strength. "You committed corporate espionage, medical assault through psychological manipulation and fraud. You turned my son's presence at that dinner into a weapon against me." Richard's face had gone from pale to grey. He looked around the room, seeing his support evaporating as board members processed the evidence of his betrayal. "But here's what you really miscalculated," Michael said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone delivering a final tactical assessment. "You assumed that Victoria's humanity was weakness, that her capacity for stress response, her love for her son, her willingness to show vulnerability, you thought these were flaws to exploit." Michael gestured toward the window where the crowd of supporters had grown throughout the morning. "Instead, you reminded everyone what real leadership looks like. Not the absence of stress, but the courage to be human under pressure. Not the elimination of emotion, but the wisdom to let love guide decision-making." Victoria stood facing the board with the dignity of someone who'd been tested and emerged stronger. "Richard orchestrated last night's attack because he knew I was evolving as a leader," she said, moving from the old model of corporate warfare toward something more sustainable, something that prioritizes the human cost of our decisions. "The company needs," Richard started desperately, "the company needs leaders who understand that strength includes vulnerability, that success requires authenticity, and that the best business decisions come from people who remember what actually matters," Victoria finished. The vote was unanimous. Richard Blackwood was immediately terminated and escorted from the building by security. The board formally censured his actions and voted full confidence in Victoria's continued leadership. But as the meeting ended, and board members filed out offering congratulations and apologies for doubting her, Victoria felt something more important than professional vindication. She felt the pride of fighting for her family and winning. So Michael said quietly as they gathered their materials, "How does it feel to destroy a corporate conspiracy?" "It feels like the second best thing that happened this week," Victoria replied. "What was the first?" Victoria looked at Michael, this man who'd helped her son through panic attacks and taught her what real partnership looked like. "Finding my family," she said simply. The view from Victoria's office had changed since the board meeting ended. The protesters had dispersed, replaced by reporters conducting interviews with employees and board members who wanted to share their support for Victoria's leadership. The attempted coup had backfired spectacularly, transforming her moment of vulnerability into a symbol of authentic leadership. But Victoria barely noticed the media circus 40 floors below. Her attention was focused on the conversation happening around her conference table, where Michael was reviewing the job offer that had emerged from the boardroom victory. Chief Strategic Wellness Officer Michael read from the contract, responsible for developing company-wide policies that prioritize employee mental health, work-life balance, and authentic leadership development. It was a position that hadn't existed before today, created specifically to harness Michael's unique combination of tactical intelligence and human insight. The salary was more than he'd made in 5 years of delivery driving and maintenance work combined. "I can't accept this," Michael said quietly. Victoria felt her heart sink. "Why not?" "You've proven you're qualified for strategic work at the highest level." The board was impressed by, "It's not about qualifications," Michael interrupted gently. "It's about priorities. If I take this job, I'll be traveling for presentations, managing multiple projects, working the same 70-hour weeks that nearly destroyed you." He looked out the window toward the Seattle skyline, where somewhere Emma was probably getting out of school expecting her father to be there for pickup like always. I left military intelligence because I realized success means nothing if you lose your family in the process. Michael continued, I won't make that mistake again, even for a cause I believe in. Victoria studied his face, seeing the conflict between his desire to help and his commitment to the promises he'd made to Emma. It was the same struggle she'd been wrestling with for years, the impossible balance between professional impact and personal presence. What if we restructured the offer, Victoria suggested. Part-time consulting, flexible schedule projects you can manage around Emma's needs. Michael shook his head. Victoria, you need someone who can give this job their complete attention. The company deserves better than part-time commitment to such important work. The company deserves someone who actually understands what work-life balance looks like, Victoria countered. Someone who's proven they can prioritize family without sacrificing professional excellence. She pulled out a revised contract she'd been working on during the board meeting. 30 hours per week maximum. No travel during school hours. Complete control over your project schedule, and a childcare stipend so Emma can be part of the office environment when needed. Michael stared at the document. You're serious about this? I'm serious about changing how this company defines success. Victoria said. Richard's attack worked because I'd accepted the traditional model of corporate leadership. Presence equals weakness, emotion equals instability, family needs equal professional failure. She walked to the window, looking down at the city where millions of parents were struggling with the same impossible choices. But what if we built something different? What if Matthews Industries became the company that proved human leaders make better decisions? That parents who prioritize their children's well-being also create more sustainable business practices? Michael joined her at the window, considering the possibility. You're talking about fundamentally changing corporate culture. I'm talking about saving other families from the isolation. Connor and I were trapped in, Victoria said. You showed me that presence isn't the opposite of power. It's the foundation of real leadership. And if the board objects to this new approach, Victoria's smile was sharp and confident. The board just watched you dismantle a corporate conspiracy in 20 minutes. They're not going to question your methods. Michael was quiet for several minutes, weighing the offer against his commitments to Emma and his own hard-won wisdom about what truly mattered. There's one more condition, he said finally. This job has to be something Emma can be proud of. She needs to understand what I'm doing and why it matters. Deal, Victoria said immediately. In fact, I think Emma should be our first consultant on family-friendly workplace policies. No one understands work-life balance better than an 8-year-old. Michael's laugh was surprised and genuine. You want to hire my daughter as a consultant. I want to create an environment where bringing your whole self to work, including your role as a parent, makes you more valuable, not less. They shook hands on the agreement, but Victoria found herself reluctant to let go of Michael's fingers. The professional partnership they'd just formalized was important, but the personal connection they'd discovered felt even more significant. Victoria said carefully, I hope this job offer isn't the only reason you'll be staying in our lives. He studied her face, seeing the vulnerability behind her professional confidence. What are you asking, Victoria? I'm asking if you think what happened between us this week was just crisis bonding, or if there's something real worth exploring. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and risk. They'd known each other for less than 48 hours, but those hours had included more authentic connection than Victoria had experienced in years of carefully managed relationships. Connor asked me this morning if I was going to be his daddy. Michael said quietly. I told him that's not how families work, that these things take time to develop properly. Victoria's breath caught. What did he say? He said, time doesn't matter when people fit together, right? Michael's smile was gentle but uncertain. He's a smart kid, but I'm not sure we should base major life decisions on the wisdom of a 6-year-old, even if that 6-year-old has better instincts about relationships than most adults. Victoria stepped closer, feeling the pull of connection that had been building since their first conversation at the restaurant. Michael, I know this is crazy. I know we barely know each other, but Connor's right about one thing. I've never felt like I fit with anyone the way I fit with you. Victoria. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Victoria said quickly. I'm asking if you want to see what happens when we stop analyzing this connection and start trusting it. Michael was quiet for a long moment, considering the enormous changes that accepting her invitation would bring to both their lives. There's something you need to understand, he said finally. If we do this, if we really try to build something together, I won't change who I am to fit into your world. I don't want you to change, Victoria said honestly. I want you to help me remember who I used to be before I forgot that success without joy is just expensive emptiness. And Connor deserves to grow up in a family where love is demonstrated, not just discussed. Victoria said, You've shown him more authentic affection in 2 days than I managed in 6 years. I want to learn from that. Michael looked at the woman who'd transformed from ice-cold CEO to vulnerable mother to strategic partner in less than a week. The professional offer was attractive, but the personal possibility felt like coming home to a place he'd never known existed. Okay, he said quietly. Let's see what happens. Victoria felt something unlock in her chest, a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with business strategy or public relations, and everything to do with the simple human recognition of finding your person. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of children's laughter echoing through the office suite. Connor and Emma burst through the reception area, both slightly out of breath and completely exhilarated. Mom Connor called, running toward Victoria with more animation than she'd seen from him in months. Emma and I figured out how to make the elevator stop on every single floor. It was like a magical mystery tour of the whole building. Emma joined Connor in front of Victoria's desk, her face glowing with excitement. Uncle Michael, your new office is amazing. It has windows that look out at the water, and there's a meeting room with a round table like King Arthur's knights. Victoria looked between the children's faces and Michael's amused expression, feeling a sense of completion that she'd never experienced in any boardroom victory. So you approve of the new arrangement? Victoria asked the children. Are you kidding? Connor said with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. Uncle Michael gets to work here and live with us. It's like having the best parts of both our worlds in the same place, Emma nodded vigorously. Plus now I get to have sleepovers at the mansion. And Uncle Michael gets to use his smart brain for important work instead of just carrying packages. The simple wisdom of children's perspective made both adults smile. In Emma and Connor's view, the complex negotiations of merging families and careers were simply logical solutions that made everyone happier. Well then, Michael said, pulling both children into a group hug. I guess we're officially a team now. Victoria watched the 3 people she'd come to love most in the world celebrate their new beginning, and realized that Richard Blackwood had actually done her a favor. His attack had forced her to choose between corporate image and authentic connection, between strategic control and vulnerable trust, between the isolation of traditional success and the messiness of real family. She'd chosen love, and for the first time in her adult life, Victoria Matthews felt like she'd made the right decision. 6 months later, the conference room at Matthews Industries buzzed with quiet energy as Victoria reviewed the quarterly reports that would have consumed her entire weekend just a year ago. But today was Saturday, and the only reason she was at the office was to collect materials for Monday's presentation to potential investors interested in their revolutionary workplace wellness program. Through the glass walls, she could see Michael in his office video conferencing with a company in Portland that wanted to implement their family-first policies. Emma sat at the round table in his office, coloring intently, while occasionally offering suggestions about playgrounds and juice boxes that made the adults on the call laugh. Connor appeared at Victoria's elbow, carrying a stack of handwritten thank you letters from employees whose lives had been transformed by the company's new policies. "Mom, look at this one," Connor said, pointing to a letter from a single mother in accounting. She says she got to see her daughter's school play for the first time in 3 years because of the flexible schedule program Uncle Michael created. Victoria smiled, scanning the letter. The workplace culture changes Michael had implemented were showing measurable results. Employee satisfaction up 40%, productivity improved despite reduced hours turnover down to almost 0. But the real success stories were in letters like this one, documenting the human cost savings that never appeared on profit-loss statements. "Are you proud of the work Uncle Michael's doing?" Victoria asked Connor. "I'm proud of the work we're all doing," Connor corrected with the wisdom of someone who'd learned to see family as a team effort. "Uncle Michael makes the plans, you make sure the company listens to them. Emma tests if they actually work for kids, and I help write the reports." It was true. Their unconventional family had become an equally unconventional business partnership, with each member contributing their unique perspective to the company's transformation. Emma had indeed become their youngest consultant, testing everything from office playground equipment to conference room snack policies. Her feedback had led to the installation of quiet spaces for overwhelmed parents' lactation rooms with actual comfort features and a company-wide policy that no meetings could be scheduled during peak school pickup hours. Victoria's leadership style had evolved as well. The ice-cold CEO, who'd once intimidated competitors, was now known for her authentic approach to executive decision-making, her willingness to admit uncertainty, and her insistence that sustainable success required considering the human impact of every business strategy. "Is Uncle Michael done with his meeting?" Connor asked clearly, eager to begin their weekly family ritual. "Almost," Victoria said, watching Michael wrap up his call while Emma carefully packed her art supplies. "Go tell him we're ready for grocery shopping." Saturday afternoon trips to Pike Place Market had become sacred family time. Victoria, Michael, Connor, and Emma wandering through the vendor stalls, selecting ingredients for their weekend cooking projects completely anonymous among the tourists and locals. Mrs. Victoria Emma's voice carried across the office as she ran toward the conference room. "Uncle Michael says we can make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs tomorrow if we buy the right kind of batter." "Dinosaur pancakes sound perfect," Victoria said, gathering Emma into a hug that had become as natural as breathing. "Are you ready for our market adventure?" "Always ready for adventures with my family," Emma said with the matter-of-fact contentment of a child who'd never doubted her place in the world. Michael appeared in the conference room doorway, laptop bag in one hand, reaching for Victoria's hand with the other. "How was the investor prep? Boring numbers and strategic projections," Victoria said, intertwining their fingers. "How was the Portland consultation? Inspiring. They want to implement the full program, including Emma's playground recommendations." Michael's smile was the same warm expression that had first caught Victoria's attention in the restaurant almost a year ago. "She's becoming quite the policy expert." "I'm becoming hungry," Connor announced with dramatic emphasis. "And those salmon vendors at the market close early on Saturdays." "Then we'd better hurry," Victoria said, but she paused for a moment to look around her office. The space had changed as much as she had. Gone were the intimidating power symbols and museum-quality art pieces. In their place were Emma's drawings, Connor's school projects, family photos from their weekend adventures, and thank you letters from employees whose lives had been improved by their policy changes. It was still a CEO's office, but now it looked like it belonged to a human being. The drive to Pike Place Market took them through downtown Seattle, past the restaurant where their story had begun. Victoria found herself glancing toward Bella Vista every time they passed, remembering the desperate woman in the elegant dress who'd been so close to losing everything that mattered. "Do you ever miss it?" Michael asked quietly, following her gaze. The way things used to be. The simplicity of only having yourself to worry about, Victoria considered the question seriously. Her life was infinitely more complicated now, balancing Connor's needs with Emma's, managing a romantic relationship alongside a business partnership, learning to share decision-making after years of complete control. But complicated didn't mean difficult. It meant rich, layered, full of the kind of meaning she'd spent decades trying to purchase with achievements and acquisitions. I miss the certainty, Victoria admitted. When it was just me, I always knew what success looked like. Now I have to consider whether a decision will make Connor anxious, or take time away from Emma's bedtime stories, or put pressure on you to work longer hours. And is that harder or easier? Victoria watched Connor and Emma in the back seat, sharing headphones and giggling at something on Connor's tablet. They'd become inseparable, more like twins than step-siblings, each bringing out qualities in the other that made them both braver and kinder. It's easier, Victoria said with certainty, because now when I make decisions, I know what I'm working toward. Not just success, but the kind of success that makes the people I love proud to be part of my life. The market was crowded with weekend shoppers, tourists photographing the fish-throwing vendors, and local families stocking up on fresh ingredients. Victoria and Michael followed Connor and Emma through the maze of stalls, holding hands like teenagers, while the children debated the merits of different apple varieties. Uncle Michael Emma said seriously, studying a display of artisanal cheeses when you and Mrs. Victoria get married, can Connor and I be in charge of choosing the wedding cake? The question caught both adults by surprise. They'd been living together for 4 months, functioning as a family unit, but they'd deliberately avoided discussing formal commitments while focusing on the daily work of blending their lives. That's a very important job, Michael said carefully. Are you sure you and Connor are qualified for cake selection? We're extremely qualified, Connor said with complete seriousness. We've taste-tested every bakery in Seattle during our weekend adventures. We have scientific data about frosting types and flavor combinations. Victoria laughed despite her racing heart. You've been conducting cake research without telling us. We wanted to be prepared for when you're ready to make it official, Emma explained with the practical logic of childhood planning. Adults sometimes need time to figure out what kids already know. And what do kids already know? Victoria asked. That you love each other, and we love all of us being together. So getting married is just the logical next step, Connor said, as if explaining basic mathematics. Michael caught Victoria's eye over the children's heads, seeing her uncertainty mixed with hope. They'd built something beautiful together, but formalizing it felt like acknowledging that their happiness was permanent rather than the temporary respite from loneliness they'd both feared it might be. What do you think? Michael asked quietly. Are you ready for the logical next step? Victoria looked at the man who'd saved her life in a restaurant, who'd taught her son to manage anxiety, who'd helped her remember what authentic leadership looked like. Then she looked at Emma, who'd brought joy and creativity into their carefully controlled world, and Connor, who'd bloomed into the confident, happy child she'd always hoped he could become. I think Victoria said slowly, that I'm ready for whatever comes next, as long as we're facing it together. Michael's smile transformed his entire face. Is that a yes? That's a yes to everything, Victoria said. To marriage, to cake-choosing committees, to whatever adventures this family wants to tackle next. Connor and Emma erupted in cheers that drew amused glances from nearby vendors. Emma immediately began planning wedding details with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been thinking about this possibility for months. Can we have the ceremony at the mansion garden? Emma asked. With those pretty lights you have strung by the water, and can Uncle Michael's sister bring her kids, so we have cousins at the wedding? Connor added. And can we serve dinosaur-shaped cookies at the reception? Emma continued. Victoria laughed at their rapid-fire planning, feeling lighter and happier than she'd ever imagined possible. Yes to all of it. But first we need to finish our shopping and get home for dinner. As they continued through the market, now officially an engaged family rather than just a family in practice, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A year ago, she'd been a woman whose son was afraid of crowds, whose only relationships were transactional, whose idea of success was the accumulation of power and wealth. She'd been days away from losing everything that mattered while convinced she was protecting it. Now she was planning a wedding with input from two 8-year-olds running a company that prioritized human well-being over profit margins, and looking forward to spending Saturday evening making dinner with her fiancé, while their children built blanket forts in rooms that had finally learned to echo with laughter. The transformation hadn't been easy. Learning to share decision-making, to prioritize relationship maintenance over business achievements, to trust that vulnerability could be strength rather than weakness, all of it had required dismantling beliefs she'd held since childhood. But standing in Pike Place Market surrounded by the controlled chaos of weekend family life, Victoria understood that the best investments weren't in companies or properties or stock portfolios. The best investments were in the people who chose to love you despite your flaws, who celebrated your victories without envy, and who stood beside you when crisis threatened to destroy everything you'd built. Victoria Matthews had finally learned the difference between being successful and being happy. And she'd discovered that with the right family, you could have both. Friends, if this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, if it reminded you that sometimes the most unexpected encounters change our lives forever, please don't just watch and walk away. Hit that subscribe button and join our channel family for more heartwarming tales that restore your faith in humanity. Share this with someone who needs to remember that kindness still matters, that love can be found in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the person who saves us is the one we never expected. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had a moment where a stranger's kindness changed everything? Your stories inspire us all. Thanks for watching, and remember, you never know whose life you might change with one simple act of compassion. If this story moved you, hit that like button because your support helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to families everywhere. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder that second chances and new beginnings are always possible, no matter how dark things might seem. Until next time, keep believing in the power of human kindness.